Welcome back to another Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're diving into a really profound topic. We're looking at the incredibly rich intersection of faith, artistic expression, and human understanding. A lot of the time we just treat art as mere decoration, right? Just a pretty picture on a wall or a catchy tune to pass the time on our commute. But today, we're flipping that on its head. We're going to look at how scholars, theologians, and creators across a ton of different traditions, from deep Christian theological proposals all the way to Islamic-inspired fiction, view art not as decoration, but as a vital, rigorous way of actually knowing things. Throughout this explainer, we'll see how disciplines like painting, music, film, and poetry aren't just for entertainment. They serve as essential tools for spiritual formation, moral development, and even healing from really deep trauma.
Okay, so let's dive right into this. The big question we're tackling is this. How do we actually bridge the gap between the mundane and the transcendent? How do we connect our ordinary, everyday, frankly exhausting existence with something divine, infinite, and just so much greater than ourselves? This is literally the core problem humanity has wrestled with for millennia, and as you're going to see, the arts offer a totally unique, truly irreplaceable bridge between the two.
Our journey really has to start inwardly. The theosophist Annie Besant actually put this beautifully. She noted, knowledge of spiritual truths must thus obtained from within and not from without, from the divine spirit whose temple we are. What she's getting at here is that before we can even begin to recognize the divine in, say, a brilliant painting or a sweeping symphony, we actually have to first recognize this inner divine spark within ourselves that's actively seeking that expression and connection.
Section 1. The Inner Divine Spark, the Esoteric Roots of Creation.
So it's this inner spirit that really drives us. It pushes us to seek communion with the divine in a really tangible way, right through the physical material world around us. Besant points us toward what she calls the occult, or the hidden side of nature. Now, this is basically the recognition of a hidden consciousness or a mind that underlies all physical phenomena. It's this beautiful idea that there's an omnipresent consciousness making everyday objects, places, and materials deeply sacred. Think about it. When an artist takes a seemingly mundane object, like a blank canvas, a scrap of wood, or a heavy block of marble, and they create something with it, they're actually objectifying this universal presence. They're making it so the rest of us can actually sense it.
Section 2. Art as Spiritual Contemplation. Escaping the Noise.
Now, knowing that this hidden consciousness exists is one thing, but how do we actually tap into it when our modern world is just, so incredibly loud? Let's be real, in our modern existence, we are constantly bombarded. We're hit with endless visual noise, the doom scrolling, and this mechanized, industrialized work that just totally exhausts us. Thinkers like Joseph Piper have actually pointed out that this environment causes a sort of visual impairment, like we literally lose the ability to truly see the world around us. But contrast this with the ancient, very deliberate practice of contemplation and pure attention. The philosopher Simone Weil actually characterized this kind of pure, focused attention to the world as a literal form of prayer. It's a direct gateway to the divine.
The ancient Greeks actually had a specific word for this exact concept, theoria. It translates to gazing at or beholding. And early Christian thinkers adapted this word to mean a knowledge of God that is completely impregnated with love. So when an artist sits down and engages in a really concentrated effort of creating, even something as simple and active as drawing a leaf or sketching a face, they are participating in theoria. They aren't just doodling to kill time. They are engaging in a profound act of generous prayer. They are actively beholding the essence of creation.
And this brings us to a brilliant illustration of the tension involved in creating art. When the post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne was asked what his absolute greatest hope was, his reply was just one word: certainty. Cézanne painted almost 30 portraits of his wife, and they're famously abstract. But why? Well, because his work embodied what theologians call an apophatic hesitation. In Christian theology, apophatic means acknowledging that God is ultimately incomprehensible. We just can't perfectly define the infinite. Cézanne knew he couldn't perfectly represent the infinite, complex reality of his wife on a flat 2D canvas, but he sought the truth anyway. His abstraction was basically a visual confession of our human limits, mixed with this really profound hope for certainty.
Section 3. Forming the Moral Imagination. Empathy, Healing, and Emblems.
Now, you might be surprised to learn that art directly impacts fields you wouldn't normally expect. For example, the medical humanities use art to teach doctors how to truly see their patients. Margaret Edson's incredible play Wit is actually used to reveal the heartbreaking gaps in hospitality and humanization within clinical care. Visual arts are being used to train medical students in precise, close observation.
because, as it turns out, diagnosing a patient requires the exact same careful eye as analyzing a master painting. Improv theater is even being used to foster empathy and adaptability in doctor-patient communication. But it's also profoundly seen in literature. Islamic-inspired fiction functions as a ridiculously powerful tool to bridge cultural divides and foster deep empathy for really diverse experiences. And looking back historically, poets like Lucy Hutchinson viewed the entire natural world as a divine emblem book, a sort of visual text meant to be actively read to deeply understand God's nature. So, quite literally, art trains our empathy.
And an absolutely crucial part of that empathy is memory. This brings us to the concept of Zikor, which is the Hebrew imperative to remember and not forget. But Zikor isn't just about passively recalling a history lesson, it's a living practice that makes the past immediately relevant to our present moment. The German artist Käthe Kollwitz used this concept so powerfully. Through her printmaking and sculpture, she translated her own profound personal grief over war and loss into universal art. Her art essentially functions as Zikor. It serves as a pedagogical tool that completely disrupts our present moment and demands moral sensitivity and real action from the viewer. It flat out refuses to let us look away from suffering.
Section 4. The wounds that heal, trauma, time, and rupture.
Which brings us to a really profound paradox. Can art that wounds also heal? Consider Doris Salcedo's installation Shibboleth. For this piece, she literally carved a massive 548-foot physical crack right into the concrete floor of the Tate Modern Museum in London. It looked incredibly violent, like a terrible, earth-shattering rupture, but it actually functioned as a vital invitation. It forced viewers to physically acknowledge the deep fault lines and cultural divides running through our society. Because acknowledging a wound, really looking at that rupture, is the absolute necessary first step to bridging it and eventually finding healing.
Trauma is uniquely devastating because it completely distorts our reality, specifically how we experience time. Psychologically, trauma causes a collapse of time. Sufferers often feel stuck, endlessly reliving past horrors like a broken record. We actually see this brilliantly depicted in modern pop culture. Think of Vecna's curse in the show Stranger Things. The victims are trapped in their worst, darkest memories, while a grandfather clock just ominously ticks away. Or consider the fantastic film Arrival. It uses a palindromic, circular narrative structure to make the viewer viscerally feel the absolute disorientation of time and grief that the main character is experiencing.
So the really crucial question here is, how do we break that loop? Wonderfully, the antidote is very often found in the arts. Music and visual narratives have this incredible ability to actually restructure the traumatized mind. Back to Stranger Things, it's Kate Bush's music that empowers Max to break Vecna's mind control, right? It restores her connection to the present moment and to her friends. In Arrival, Johan Johansson's haunting, wordless musical score mirrors the massive disruption of trauma, but slowly it reintegrates the inexplicable into totally new ways of comprehension. Art manages to bypass pure logic to literally reorganize a traumatized brain and restore a sense of eschatological hope. That's the ultimate promise, that the future can actually be different and better than the past.
Section 5. A unique way of knowing. The symphony of the senses.
The big takeaway here is that each artistic medium is its own irreplaceable way of knowing. Think about music. It exposes our bittersweet longings and actually trains our heart to stretch out toward divine fulfillment. Then you have visual art, which acts as an interruptive event. The theologian Eberhard Jungel suggests that beauty literally interrupts our normal everyday context to give us a sneak preview of new, eschatological possibilities, like a glimpse of a completely new earth. And then there's literature, which utilizes subversive aesthetics. Whether it's the upside-down demonic perspective of C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters or the incredibly rich bridge-building narratives of Islamic-inspired fiction we touched on earlier, literature shakes us out of our complacency. It captures our imagination way more effectively than a dry textbook ever could.
I absolutely love this quote from filmmaker Matthew Autry. He says, "Art is a form of play. And as we play, we discover knowledge which becomes available to us only through means of imagination." Engaging with art, creating it, seeking understanding through it. Listen, this isn't just an elite, stuffy, academic exercise for scholars. It is a joyful, fundamentally human way to discover truth. Through the literal constraints of creativity, we basically play our way into profound spiritual realities.
Historic thinkers often use this analogy of comparing our souls to wax, taking on the exact shape of whatever stamps are imprinted upon it. We literally become what we behold. So, I want to leave you with this final thought today. If you become what you behold, what are you choosing to look at? Are you just letting the noise and the mundane casually stamp your soul? Or are you deliberately seeking out the art, the beauty, and the profound imagination that points you directly toward the transcendent? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer today. Curate your aesthetic life carefully, and I'll see you next time.